Ronnie, I want to say welcome.
Appreciate you.
Give thanks for you coming out. Please tell me how a child with ADHD, a learning disability called dysgraphia, who was placed in special education, became an award-winning author.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. Malcolm Gladwell has a book called Outliers, and he talks about he calls them these disadvantages, but oftentimes become advantageous. So, having dysgraphia or having ADHD, having any type of disadvantage, if you are a person who's driven, who has a good support system, you can actually use those weaknesses as strengths. So, for me, growing up, being in special education, feeling feeling like there was something, wrong with me, it sort of pushed me to want to succeed. I had a teacher tell me I wasn't going to college. So, for some kids in the class, it could have, discouraged them. For me, it motivated me. Having ADHD, I tell people it's like a superpower because, it's hard for you to focus on a lot of things, but you can find like one thing and like hyper focus on. So for me,
before we continue, right? Because you're an adult now, you have a different perspective.
Yeah.
What does it feel like exactly to have? We hear it all the time.
Right.
Like, please explain for you, what did it feel like to have ADHD?
So for me now as an adult with ADHD, it's really helpful. Like for me, publishing a book, it was something I was able to put like 100% energy, 100% focus in. I was able to see the task through from beginning to end. But for me, getting started is sometimes difficult because sometimes you really disorganized. Sometimes it's hard to get focused. But when you do focus and get locked in, you sort of get the tunnel vision. But sometimes that's not good if you have a wife and you have kids and you have bills and have expenses because you focus all your time on publishing this book, which can cost, for me about $5,000 per book. So you're taking resources, you're taking up a lot of time. But the ability, like I said, to focus on this and to be driven, it really sort of motivates you, like it energizes you. So for me, it energized me to promote my book, to find the people I needed to write the book, to do speaking engagement. So it sort of like unlocked parts of me that, that I loved. They were sort of my gifts. But growing up, they were things that caused me a lot of problems. But as an adult, I could use them to actually generate some income and also be able to share my story to inspire other people.
All right. I want to jump back as a kid though, right? Like when you have ADHD, did you have something that you used to focus on back then as a kid that you enjoyed, that you really focused on?
So my dad, we were really interested in like trading cards. So I was really into like getting trading cards, like baseball cards, football cards. I used to put a lot of energy in that. Rap music. I used to think of myself as a rapper. So I used to like write these rhymes and we would like exchange rhymes in school. I have ciphers. So I would say like my first real love for literacy was really in rapping, and writing my lyrics down and really trying to come up with a clever punchline. So it really got me sort of putting my thoughts down on paper, not so much in an academic way, but just more so in a creative way. So it was like certain parts of my life, certain things that I would like hyper focus on, but sometimes that attention would sort of pull away from other areas like academics.
And can you please explain what dysgraphia is?
So dysgraphia is a neurological condition that affects your ability to write. So for me, my handwriting wasn't legible, so teachers couldn't read it. So in my IEP, they said, well, individualized education plan, which is something that the schools produce. They said that I needed to do my work on a computer. Granted, I'm born in '83. So, back in the 90s, my dad was like the only black person I knew with a computer. So, I had the ability to type my stuff in, but my handwriting was so bad the teachers couldn't read it. It also affects your ability to organize your ideas and thoughts on paper. So it's more so a disability that sort of looks at your writing ability, whether it's writing down, words or letters, or also organizing your thoughts into writing them down.
So how were you able to overcome that?
Thank God for Microsoft Word. So, assistive technology, and I think that's a term that a lot of people don't understand or don't know, but it's something that a lot of special education teachers and, professionals know. So my glasses is assistive technology. I didn't like to wear my glasses in school and I couldn't see the board, which probably affected my academics tremendously. But once I started wearing my glasses, it gave me an advantage. I could see the board. That's just like typing. So on Microsoft Word, it probably would drive some people crazy, but I have like 8 or 9 Microsoft Word tabs open. especially in writing my book or writing papers. So I'm able to multitask. So for me, it's easier for me to see 8 or 9 tasks versus looking at a sheet of paper because it's almost like more linear. But I'm able to open up multiple tasks. I can put some thoughts here. I can move down to the clear part of the page, start a new idea. Versus if I'm writing it down, I'm already not able to read my writing. But then I'm erasing, I'm adding new ideas, I'm taking away ideas. So it's really sort of a jumbled mess. But I would say Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, those different tools, it really gave me an outlet to express myself in a more clear and precise way. So I would say that definitely changed everything.
All right. When they put you in special education, right? Did you clearly know you were in special education, and also did it mess with your confidence?
You know what? I didn't know I was in quote unquote special education until I got to 7th grade. I think 7th grade when it sort of the light bulb went off, like, you know, my friends aren't going to this class. And I'm looking at the kids that's in the class, and kids know who underperform and who overperform, you know, in certain things. So, you know, I think I say 6th or 7th grade is when I became real conscious of this place is for people that's not good at academics. But in elementary school, it was sort of fun because the teachers would take you out of class. They have like little prizes you can get at the end of class. Of course, the token system to try to get you motivated to do the work. But in elementary school, I didn't really care. I thought it was more of a privilege. But once I got to middle school and became a little bit more self-aware, I realized that, you know, certain kids came here and that, you know, these teachers have a different, they're looking at me a little bit differently and evaluate me a little differently. And this is not a place that, you know, cool kids or popular kids want to be. So I used to actually sneak to class. In my book, I compare Nelson to a ninja. Nelson's the main character because I would literally like come to my special education resource class late or go early to avoid my friends seeing me. And my best friends didn't even know I was in special education until I told them after high school because I felt comfortable sharing it. But that stigma it was huge, man. It was almost like a burden to be in those classes and to walk around school acting like everything was normal, but understanding and knowing that, you know, things weren't normal and that, you know, the school didn't identify me as being quote unquote normal.
When did you start to excel academically?
College. Yeah, college. High school, elementary, middle school, I underperformed. I think the ADHD, I was more so on the social side of it. I just wanted to play with my friends. I wanted to be a class clown. I wanted to do everything other than focus on the work. And teachers didn't really have any high expectations from me either. So they kind of set the bar right here. And I was fine sort of being right here. My parents, I mean, my grades were like C's, D's. So they didn't really have a high academic bar for me. I would say when I graduated high school, I was sort of driven to like succeed because 12th grade year was extremely frightening. I was terrified of graduating school. Like I signed up for the Army and I didn't really know what to do. Like I was scared. But in college, I decided that I was going to go to college with no accommodations. Like I didn't want to have an IEP. I won't have these teachers, people that know me, to have this history. And I think sometimes as a student with disabilities or African American students, when you go up to different grades, sort of your reputation precedes you. And where I'm from, it's an elementary, middle, and high school. There's no other school. So, you know, you start, like the people you start with kindergarten with are the people you finish with in 12th grade. So having that reputation, you know, it's hard to erase it. It's hard to run away from it. But when I went to college, nobody knew me. You know, I could set my own expectations. So I think that's when I realized that it was sink or swim. And I decided to swim.
All right. So I know you did community college, right? Then
Yeah.
you transferred to Old Dominion.
Yes.
How was the transition from community college to Old Dominion?
It was probably, I would say, I always tell people community college, especially with someone with disabilities or maybe you're just not that strong of a student, it's a really good transition because I went to a really small community college. It was in Richmond, Virginia called J. Sergeant Reynolds. And the counselors, even the students, a lot of the students were adult students. So the teachers were a lot more patient. They weren't much more focused on, you know, sort of the content, but just more focused on how can we help assist you get into the next level. So, you know, the deadlines weren't as hard as they are when you go to a university. The teachers have a lot more availability in terms of office time. Some of the teachers work a second job themselves, so they understood what the struggle was like. And they also understood the type of students that were coming in. So I would say it was a lot more patience. I didn't feel like just a number. When I went to Old Dominion, I love Old Dominion, much respect to Old Dominion. But when you go to a school that has 25, 30,000 students, you are essentially your number, and it's not that closeness, that ability to go to your teacher and be available to talk. You got to sign up for office hours. But I felt like community college sort of gave me that confidence because I was able to pass classes. Like I made the dean's list like my second semester. I'm like, damn, I never made honor roll in school. But be seeing that I was able to succeed and do well, and that sort of gave me that confidence just to keep going. And I tell people I felt like high school was harder than college for me, and it's because I think the ADHD and disability. When I was in school, we took 7 classes a day. So can you imagine a disorganized student having to figure out how to manage 7 classes a day for an entire year? I felt like that was something that was challenging. But when in college, I only had 4 classes. I could have like 2 classes in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or I can do Tuesday and Thursday for 2 classes. I was able to balance my work out a lot. Even though the workload was more, I could balance it out to where I could sort of focus on 1 or 2 classes versus focusing on 7 classes a day for an entire year.
What advice would you give to parents whose children have ADHD?
I would say patience. A lot of times, it's not necessarily the kid with the ADHD, it's sort of the adults who have to sort of live with it or manage it. And I think sometimes adults get a little, they get concerned, and sometimes they become like over aggressive in how they deal with it. They used to call me Pluck growing up. And I realized it was because my mom used to pluck me all the time when I acted up. And I think parents of kids with ADHD, sometimes it's just so much. The kids are so energized, it's everywhere. And sometimes it can like draw on a parent and they get really frustrated. And I think sometimes that can really affect how a kid with ADHD perceive themselves. And sometimes they see themselves as an issue, as the problem, versus seeing, okay, I have this dysregulation. I don't really know what's causing it. I don't really know how to deal with it. I don't really have the tools to deal with it. And I don't have a parent that's patient enough to deal with it. It just really creates a lot of anxiety and the stress on the child. But I think if they have adults, whether it's parents or teachers, who understand, okay, this is what's going on. Okay, these are some tools to deal with it. All right, I'm gonna take a deep breath because I need one. I need a break. I need to, figure it out and I need to come back to it versus, seeing this kid as a problem, trying to figure out ways to get them out the way so that you can, educate the other students.
All right, transitioning in your life now, right? When did you get the courage and the vision to write a book?
When I graduated college, when I graduated Virginia Commonwealth University, I reached out to my former special education teacher because I wanted to invite her to my graduation. And she reached out to me, and I found her on Facebook. And she had just mentioned, she was like, you need to tell your story. And I took it literally. I never really had any thoughts of writing my story or telling my story. But, I thought that it would be something interesting to share because if you look at books, especially books on kids or even books with African-American characters, you don't really see the issue of disabilities, at least learning disabilities, really talked about. So, I had felt like I had earned my master's degree in social work. I felt like I achieved some level of success. And again, I had an 8th grade math teacher who told me I would never go to college. And all throughout my life, I always felt like teachers didn't think I could even finish school. So I felt like I achieved this. I need to provide this blueprint, this resource for kids who are like me or similar, and also let parents know, like, hey, chill, your kid is okay. Like, this kid went through what your kid went through, and he was able to achieve some level of success. So I wanted to instill some hope, in the parents, because oftentimes, even as a parent now, I have a 15-year-old, who has some reading issues. I see that, when you don't have the answer, you get anxiety, you get stress. Sometimes you get frustrated. Sometimes you take it out on the kid. Sometimes you go to different educators. They don't really have the answers, so it's a scary process. So I really wanted to give a book that sort of instill hope, inspiration, and let people know that even if you have challenges, no matter what your challenge is, you have the ability to overcome it. And I really highlight the adults, like my parents, my teacher, administrators, friends, because it really takes a village. Like anytime you have a kid with a challenge, it takes really a village to help motivate them, help get them through that process.
All right, what are some realistic things parents can do to help their child who is struggling with reading?
Read to your child, whether it's 10, 15 minutes a day. If they're younger, I would say read to them, sort of go through the process, maybe even read yourself, just sort of develop some type of interest in books. For me, I didn't like thick chapter books. That was very intimidating. I didn't mind reading comic books though. So I would say meet the child where they're at. If they're interested in, is it manga comics, or they're interested in Marvel, get them some books, some things that they're interested in, start them at that level. And then as they grow in reading, they may acquire, different tastes. I would also say have a conversation. Like my parents never talked to me about what it was like being in special education. They didn't really talk to me about learning disabilities. So I didn't really know. And I think sometimes ignorance can create a lot of confusion in itself. But now there's resources. There's a website called understood.org where parents can log into, educators, and they have every single disability that you can think of. And they also have individuals who have achieved some level of success who had different disabilities. So they reached out to me about 6 years ago, and they interviewed me and they interviewed my parents, and they talked about dysgraphia. I didn't even know what I had was called dysgraphia until I worked with them. Because on the IEP back in the 90s, they didn't have terms like ADHD and dysgraphia. They just sort of characterized it, but they didn't have a necessary word to look up or Google, which they didn't have. All we had is the sources back then anyway. They didn't have internet like they have now. But when you can name something, it brings a sense of comfort. So when I saw they could classify the dysgraphia, I'm looking up dysgraphia. Oh, damn, I hit this, and this point. So yeah, I had dysgraphia. But back then they didn't have a word for it. So we used to call it chicken scratch. That's what they characterize it as, which is very sort of like a pejorative, like chicken scratch. It's not a really nice term, but dysgraphia is more scientific. Okay, I can look it up. Oh, these are the symptoms. These are some things you can do to improve. So I think parents educating themselves on what's going on. Also, if you have advocates, finding an advocate. There's a lot of advocates, parents who've been through that process before, who can help provide some sense of safety and some sense of calmness. And they can also provide you with resources and outlets to help you throughout your journey. The most intimidating thing is an educated parent at those IEP meetings. And when a parent comes in there with their little notebook, even if you don't have nothing in the notebook, just show up with a notebook, take notes, because it's very intimidating. I tell those IEP meetings, whether it's me in the meeting or just going as a support for the parents, is very intimidating. You might have the principal there. You may have a teacher there. You have a psychologist there. You have everybody with all these letters behind their names. And then you have a parent who may not have finished school, a parent who may be afraid, to say anything in a meeting. But if you have an advocate there, somebody who's not afraid, who's intelligent, who is articulate, and who has all of the resources and the knowledge of law, when it comes to disabilities, you got somebody that's really going to fight for you and advocate for your student, your child, and really help your child achieve the level of success they need to achieve.
I've heard this quote, right? Most Title I teachers are babysitting and not educating.
I think a lot of Title I teachers do a level of babysitting, and it's not their fault. Me and you had a conversation talking about class size. If you have a class size of 30 students, it's going to be really hard to educate. I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell on the way up, and he was talking about how like the optimum class size is 20 to 25, because he was saying anything under 20, kids need to see other kids working and learning, and that helps them learn. But if you have a class size over 25 and 30, it's going to be really hard for the teacher to not just motivate students, but really to keep order. And when I was in school, honestly, I felt like it was two tracks. It was a track for the kids who were like gifted and talented and were very smart. And then there was a track for the other kids. And if you were in class with the other kids, the teacher was essentially not really giving her 100% full. She wasn't working hard. Like she wasn't giving you challenging work. You weren't doing any like fun assignments. It was just her, trying to discipline, her just trying to, keep everybody from knocking each other's heads off. So it's a different level of approach as a teacher. And when you put a bunch of kids in a class who aren't motivated, kids on different reading levels, kids who want to be class clowns and want to play, and a lot of kids in that class probably had learning disabilities, whether it was documented or undocumented, and it probably was difficult for her to feel like she had a purpose in the class. So essentially, if you're on that track, the teacher is essentially a babysitter. So for me, I saw that in high school. I'm like, okay, I'm in here with the kids who don't care. Some of the kids, like, 18, I'm 16. You know what I'm saying? So it's a different level of coming to a class focused, motivated, and doing what you need to do. So I try to get on the other side. And if you have an IEP or you have a disability back then, they weren't really trying to let you get on the college track. They was trying to push you on getting a job or just finishing school. So for me, I had to be able to advocate for myself. Not even my parents was really pushing me for that, but I saw my friends over there. My friends, they wanted to go to school. They were relatively smart, and they were in there with the classes with predominantly white kids, and there was like one Asian, some ethnicities, but I could tell that this is the track they wanted the kids to be successful on. So I had to literally fight to get on the track, and having an IEP and being in special education, they weren't even allowing me to take foreign language classes. That was a fight, so everything I did from about 9th grade on was a fight. Everything was a challenge. Everything was questioned because they didn't see me as capable of doing the work. And honestly, I really wasn't working up to that level of doing the work, but I knew I had the intelligence to do it, but I really didn't have anybody expecting me to do it. I just saw my friends over there. I wanted to be with my friends. I also saw that these students were treated differently. They were given different work. They had different expectations. And I didn't really want to be in that arena with kids who really didn't have that same level of expectations.
As you stated, I agree with you. Some classes, in my experience, I probably had like one class where I was literally babysitting. It is what it is, bro, right? Mm-hmm. But majority of the time, you are able to teach if you are able to manage the classroom. I think people's biggest issue is class management.
Right.
If you can't manage the class, it's just
right. and it's challenging too, because you got to look at the cultural aspects of it. You have a white woman. No disrespect to white women. And you have a class 70% black males, 30% black females. And not like the quiet black females. I'm talking about the ones that want to fight with boys types of black females. It's going to give you the lip. It's going to go back and forth with you. And if you want a teacher that's quick on your toes, if you want a teacher that's used to conflict, if you're not a teacher that's used to dealing with irate parents, then you're going to shrink. You know what I'm saying? So there were certain teachers in school, like we had a teacher named Miss Brooks. She was hardcore. Like, she didn't care what your age, your race. She was shutting everybody down. And and she was so popular. Even now, we all talk to people I went to school with, and everybody remember Miss Brooks. She was mean, but she had order. She created order. Like, she would see this order, and for her, I guess it was a pet peeve, and she would create this order. And she did not care about your parents. She make you stand outside in the rain, and you had the expectation, if I show off, this is what she's going to do, And I think some teachers, especially like newer teachers, I felt bad for them because we would always go for them because we knew they didn't really have the classroom management, and the goal was to make them cry. So instead of you focus on getting A's, your goal is to make the teacher cry. Because also, too, I tell people about students with disabilities, and even students who just struggle in general, you find different ways to distract, different ways to get out of things and to do different things. So if you can frustrate your teacher, you can make them want to quit or make them just, not call you out on your BS, then you're going to have a really good day and a really good year and probably not really learn a whole lot. So, I think there are some teachers who are really strong with classroom management, and then there's some teachers who are learning. I worked in prison too, and I would say the best people that worked in prison are people that went to the worst prison first. Like, if you can, I would say, and this is for new teachers who are listening, take the challenge of being in the hardest class first. Because if you can manage the hardest kids, the most difficult kids, the easier kids will be like a cakewalk. Challenge yourself to work, because if you can figure these kids out over here, the kids that aren't really motivated, the kids who may not even come to school all the time, the kids who don't really know what they want to do, the kids who kind of made up in their mind that, they're not going to be anything, and you can motivate them, man, the sky's the limit.
Special education students are not receiving promised services, right? Or when special education students are not receiving promised services, what do you advise parents to do about it?
The first thing a parent can do if their kids aren't receiving the required services is that you can always call for an IEP meeting. I think a lot of people think that you have to wait to the end of the school year for the IEP meeting, but you can call it, anytime that you want. So your child has an IEP, an individualized education plan, and it has different accommodations and different things on it that's saying that this is what this child needs to receive in order to be successful. And if those things aren't getting done, You call the IEP meeting, you address this with the teacher, the special ed teacher, the administrator, and let them know that these things aren't getting done. And what can we do as a team to address these issues? Let's say you come back, issues still aren't addressed. That's when I would encourage you to reach out to advocacy. In Virginia, we have an organization called PTC, which is a organization that parents can call, consultants, there are lawyers available, and there's different remedies, to address the situation. And when parents can get in contact with advocates or lawyers and really push the issue, you will see administrators do backflips to address it. So, oftentimes you see that relationship between the parent and the administrator or the school as almost as an adversarial relationship. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it is a war, for parents to get what they want, for their kids' IEP. But for me, I'm a social worker, so I like to try to be a peacemaker. But I feel like if the parent and the administrator in the school can have a really good relationship, honestly, for me, I think that's in the best interest of the child. Is when the child has a voice in the meeting, the parent has a voice in the meeting, the administrator and the special education teacher are all listening to that. Because also as a counselor, I learned early on that the parent is the expert of their child. Like, no parent should walk into a room and feel like somebody else knows their child better than them. The parent is the expert of their child. And in that meeting, the parent needs to be the one who's the voice and who's advocating, for their child. And the administrators and educators need to be the ones listening, to that parent. So having that power imbalance oftentimes kind of sort of creates that adversarial relationship. So that's why I was telling parents, you got to educate yourself. You have to know exactly what the child disability is. You have to understand what the accommodations are. You have to make sure your child understands what the accommodations are, to make sure they get in the accommodations. And then when those things aren't happening, then you have your ammunition to go back to the school, call the IEP meeting, address the issues there. And if it don't get addressed then you call the big dogs in. It's going to help support you. I would say the reinforcements, because sometimes schools don't want to accommodate because it could be expensive to accommodate. A speech pathologist, various services in school. Like if you have a kid that's nonverbal, or if you have a kid who may be, confined to a wheelchair, schools have to make accommodations. And if they can cut a corner or they can figure out a way to sort of provide the lip service and sort of string the parent along, they'll do that. And sometimes, like I said, you have to get reinforcements in to making sure that the school is doing what they're supposed to do, because the school receives funds for your child. They need to use these funds to adequately, prepare your child to succeed.
Do you think many schools that don't provide these services, it's a mixture of not having the proper staff to provide it, as well as incompetence with administration?
I will say, because I'm from a rural area, Tappahannock population 2,000. The whole county is like 10,000. So my graduating class was 81 people. We're also about 45 minutes from the nearest city. So there are some times where there can be some resource issues, personnel issues. If you're in a rural area or maybe even in a city, this doesn't have the resources to support the kids. So there are some, but then there's also some incompetence. And sometimes I would say some of it is willful negligence. Sometimes it's administrators that think they know more about their kid and know what's in the best interest of your kid more so than the parents, and the students. And I don't think there's always that level of creativity to think outside of the box. Because I think we had a conversation too. You were saying that you might have a class and there's like 10 or 15 kids in the class with an IEP. That's going to be impossible for the teacher to really meet each accommodation unless they're really creative or they're really skillful and impactful to do so. So if you have a lot of kids who have different IEP, let's say 15, 20% of your student population has a disability, that's going to require a lot of resources and a lot of creativity. And I think some administrators lack that imagination, because there may be a piece of equipment that costs $5,000 to get, but there may also be like a learning plan or a cheaper accommodation that nobody really thought about. So I think that's where it comes from, professional development. I don't know if there's a lot of educators who are not special education teachers really getting professional development around learning disabilities. now, because inclusion is really big in Virginia. So it's really big for a special education student to be included in the mainstream classroom with the assistance of a special education teacher who's also in the classroom. So, now with inclusion, every teacher is essentially a special education teacher. There's no, we're going to send all our special education students to the resource room or to the inclusion room and just keep them there for the day. Now it's all of the teachers have to learn and know how to educate kids with disabilities along with the mainstream students. And I think having students with disabilities in the classroom is really impactful for the other students, because before those students just went into the room with other kids with disabilities. They didn't really get to see them. You see them at lunch, you see them at gym, but you don't really see them in the classroom. You don't really see how they learn. And I think it also motivates the students who have disabilities in the classroom to work a little bit harder, because now you're in a class where kids are actually focusing. There's not a lot of joking. They're actually caring about the education. And I think sometimes it rubs off on those students too. So I think inclusion, honestly, is the best of both worlds. And I think it really helps the special education teacher and also the main teacher, because the special education teacher who's an assistant also is able to work for other kids in the classroom who don't have disabilities. So a lot of times the head teacher feels like that's an additional resource. So it's really a plus.
Your company, Healing Through Words, works exclusively with men who are incarcerated. Based on your experience, what role does illiteracy play in the high prison rates amongst Black males in America?
Man, it's working in the prison and jails, because I was a casework counselor, so I was essentially like a caseworker. So I'm able to see, in the Virginia Department of Corrections, if you don't have a GED, they literally force you to go to school. So in Virginia, they have what they call good time. So let's say you don't go to school and you don't have a GED, they take away your good time. So because you have to do 85% of your time, that's 15% of your time where you can get out a little early if you have all your good time. So if you don't complete your GED and you don't have a high school diploma, then you lose your good time. So you don't get it back until you enroll in the GED program. So a lot of men got their GEDs in jails and prisons because they wanted to get their good time. So it was a carrot and a stick piece. Also, a lot of trauma. I don't think a lot of people think. A lot of people with learning disabilities end up in prison. A lot of people with mental health issues end up in prison. A lot of people who were traumatized end up in prison. So for me, going into corrections when I did, we have a director. He's still the director now. His name is Harold Clark. He talked about healing environments. That's something that you never really associated with prisons, but he wanted to create healing environments in prisons, environments where the individuals are respected. They respect you, but you also respect them, because for so long people just treated them as inmates. They did their crime, that they're doing their time, and essentially they're punishing them twice. And Director Clark said that, hey, when they're incarcerated, this is their punishment. It's not your job to take away things and punish them even more while they're incarcerated. Their incarceration is their punishment. But treating them humanely. And he always talked about how if your brother or sister or uncle was incarcerated, how would you want them to be treated? So for me, as a therapist and going into an environment where they're talking about healing, I wanted to find a different way to do something I love. Like, I love writing poetry. I used to host open mic in college. I love poetry. I found that as therapeutic for me. I didn't go to a therapist in school. I use my pen as my therapy. So it also gave me an ability to be transparent and to be vulnerable. So when I got into the jails, I saw that there was a lot of men that were hardcore that, were, and you had to be hard in certain situations, because if not, people would take advantage of you. But when they came into the room for the Creative Medicine Healing Through Words group, it sort of gave them an opportunity to relax, to be themselves, to express themselves. And I wanted to create a safe environment, because if not, you might share something really personal in the group, and then somebody might take it outside the group, and then all of a sudden, you got to deal with that. So that's one thing I ask, is that, what's said in the room stays in the room, create that safe environment, and then give them that ability to express themselves. And I said, don't worry about the grammar. Don't worry about the punctuation. Just get the words down and express it. So there was certain times where I would cut out news, like pictures. And I love this. This is a writing prompt. You would just like I cut out a picture of a tree. It was like old. It was leafless, and I gave it to one of the guys. I was like, here, write a poem or write something related to this tree. And the poem came back very powerful. I mean, very strong. I mean, the ability and the talent of a lot of people that are incarcerated will blow your mind. Because a lot of times, even the guys who committed heinous crimes, you know, they could have been a straight A student in school. You know, the scary part is that oftentimes an intelligent male, especially in a different neighborhood, different area, is not something that's actually a good thing. There's kids who dumb themselves down because they didn't want to get straight A's because they might get bullied, or, oh, you better than us. So a lot of kids dumb themselves down. I think about different rappers like Gucci Mane, T.I., intellects high. You can tell they have really high IQs, high vocabulary. But if they presented themselves like a Lupe Fiasco or like a, Kendrick Lamar, they wouldn't probably get the same level of fandom as they would get as being Gucci Mane. I think his mother was a teacher. So a lot of these guys in prison and jail went through the same exact thing. But when you give them an outlet, you give them an opportunity to express that intelligence, express their creativity, to express that trauma and that pain, you see a completely different person by the end of the day. So, for me, it just showed that through writing and sharing, you can really help build up each other. I never been to prison. I never, been in some of the situations those guys have been in. But when I have a group, I'm just there as a facilitator. I'm just here. I'll throw you the prompt out there. I'll let you all write about it and do what you need to do. And we're all going to share it because they can take something from this man because they know this man has been through what they've been through. And sometimes people share, it touches people in a different way. And you know that you're not alone. And I think that's a huge piece to it. It's feeling like you're not alone and feeling like vulnerability is not a bad thing. Howard Stevenson, is a book I'm gonna share a little later on. He talks about hypermasculinity and hypervulnerability, and how those two things go hand in hand. Because if somebody is vulnerable, they're gonna be like hypermasculine because they want to sort of shield that vulnerability, and that's oftentimes what you see. If somebody poor, maybe you don't have the newest shoes, or maybe you're in a certain situation, you might mask it with being real tough or being real hard or selling drugs because you couldn't afford it, but now I'm selling drugs, I can afford and buy whatever I want. So, with that, a lot of these guys had that situation. There was a poem I wrote. It was about flying. It was about elevation. It was called Elevation. And I talked about, I compared it to being in an airplane. And one of the guys in there, I think he was from New Jersey, matter of fact, he was a drug dealer. He's like, I brought an airplane, and I was doing tractor trailers. I was just trying to figure out what is the best way for me to transport this product across, the state lines. I mean, this dude was so brilliant and so freaking smart. He purchased airplanes. And this is a dude from the hood, black guy. People probably would discount his intelligence, but the dude was extremely brilliant. And he also shared a story. This is probably related to the disability piece. And it really gave me insight. And I tell people, you have to ask questions. You can't just automatically assume somebody's in jail for murder that's the full story. So he was in there for drugs, and we had this conversation and we were talking. He was like, yeah, I think he included in one of the points, like, yeah, I sold my mother drugs. I was like, fuck, so he sold his mother drugs. But for me as a social worker, I always reserve my judgment because you never really know what the story is. He was like, yeah, I sold her drugs. He's like, yeah, she was strung out, like she was addicted to drugs. And I made sure that the person she bought the drugs from was safe and was giving her clean drugs, because he said when they were selling drugs in his neighborhood, they have a guy with a gun and a guy with a bat. So when the people came to buy drugs, let's say you didn't have the right money or you got out of line, the dude with the bat will hit you. And he said he didn't want that to happen to his mom because he would had to do something to them. So to keep his mom safe, he provided her with the drugs and the comfort at home so she wouldn't have to go out in the street. People, they do all types of things to get drugs. So if he provided it to her in a safe space, it protected her and it protected him, because if something happened to her, he would have to retaliate. And of course, I would have never known that had we had not had a conversation or had he had not written that down. And I think there's more to people than we see. You know, I feel like we only see like 1/10 of a person just based on appearance. The depth of individuals is so much that until you really have a conversation, until you maybe listen to a writing prompt, until you ask a question, you don't really know, what a person's going through.
You wrote a book, Tameka's New Dress, right? That deals with a huge problem in our schools, bullying. What advice would you give to children and their parents who are experiencing in-person and cyberbullying?
So I'm gonna start with Tameka's New Dress. So Tameka's New Dress was a book I wrote from the vantage point of being a social worker and working with kids that were being bullied. And as a counselor, I'm sure you worked in a school with school counselors. Bullying is like the number one thing that kids have to deal with. And then going back to Howard Stevenson and talking about racial literacy and dealing with conflict. When you go to school, there's no classes on conflict management. there's no classes on, now you have social emotional, classes, but back then they didn't really deal with that. They didn't really teach you how to manage conflict. And a lot of times people manage conflicts, they go back to fists. We're gonna fight. I'm gonna joke you. We're gonna do the dozens. I'm gonna make fun of your mom. Kids have a way of dealing with conflict, but it's not always healthy. So with Tameka's New Dress, I wanted to create a book of a young lady who's dealing with conflict, dealing with childhood trauma, but finding a way to articulate, to communicate, to verbalize why she's upset, in hopes that can, create a friendship versus creating another enemy. And for her dress sort of provided her with a source of confidence. For me, Jordans, I feel like Michael Jordan with the Jordans on, or you got the first day of school outfit, you feel so good, you feel fresh, you probably feel like you can get straight A's all through the school year. So sometimes you have to find outside things to help build that inner confidence up. And for the dress, I asked my illustrator to make it an African style dress, because for me, I think us understanding our culture, I just came back from Atlanta and I had a chance. They have in the High Art Museum, they have an exhibit there of Nubia. So this Nubian exhibit, when I was in school, I was really focused on consciousness and focused on learning and understanding my cultural identity. And that's the piece too that gave me another level of confidence, is knowing who I am and understanding, where I came from. So for me, being able to actually see this art, from 860 BC, to see art of Taharka, a pharaoh, he was a pharaoh of Egypt, and to see this, I wasn't able to touch it, but I could see it, I could smell it, and to know that, wow, black kings really existed, Egypt or Kemet, that was a black civilization. Growing up again in a rural area, my town is right next. So George Washington was born about 30 minutes away. Robert E. Lee was born about 35 minutes away. There's plantations all around, where I'm from. The Confederacy is really big. So growing up, they weren't empowering you on Nubia and Taharka. The Egyptians were white in the school book, so when you grew up, you learned that if you learn how to read, they cut your hand off, so it was almost like they were sort of conditioning the black students that, you don't really have, this academic thing ain't really for you. We watched the Ernest Green story. Kids trying to go to school, you got to have a National Guard there. You got the dogs attacking the students. But they never start in Africa. Everything starts at slavery. Everything starts at Jamestown, which is not that far from, where I live at. And it goes from there. But it's really no sense of like cultural identity. So when I wrote Tameka's New Dress, her grandmother sews her this dress. And I chose a grandmother because there's so many kids being raised by their grandparents because their parents either incarcerated, on drugs, or there's multiple kids. They get removed from their home. So I wanted to have the grandmother because I feel like there's also a disconnect between the elders and the youth. And I think there's so much wisdom with our elders that our youth, they need that and they want that and they desire that. But because the parents aren't necessarily there, involved, or able or capable of providing that, there's sort of this gap. So her grandmother sews us this African style dress. And when she go to school, she thinks she the it, So she flexing a little bit. And that girl like, oh, so now you think you got this dress. Now you think you African queen. And she's like, yeah, I am. You know what I'm saying? And she's able to sort of verbalize that conflict in a way to where she can like, I know who I am, but what's wrong with you? And in therapy, and even now, sometimes it's not right to ask what's wrong with you. Sometimes you should ask what happened to you. Because when you say what's happened to you, that can open up a lot of conversation versus what's wrong with you, because you already give me the impression something's wrong with me, for one. But what happened to you? So for instance, Tameka is lighter skin. So I want to deal with colorism in the book too. So Tameka's lighter, the other character's darker. So there's kind of this conflict there. But because we haven't really dealt with this issue as a community, we haven't dealt with colorism. And I think kids are a lot more accepting now. But when I was in school, if you were really dark skinned, you got teased. You got picked on. Light skinned girls got teased for being light. However,
it's still the same vibe.
It's still the same. But however, being lighter, it does come with some level of privilege versus, when you dark skinned.
Bottom of the barrel.
Bottom of the barrel. So I wanted to create a story where you have these two characters who initially kind of beefing, but they find a commonality. They have a bond, they have a friendship, because for so long, whether it was the Willie Lynch or whether there's always been a sort of, whether it was direct or indirect, there's always been division within culture. Now you see this whole thing with foundational Black Americans versus Black Americans who were whose ancestors were enslaved here. But when I started college, the first book I read was The Philosophy of the Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, his birthday is a few days apart from mine. Like Marcus Garvey, for me, was one of the most inspirational figures I've ever learned about, but I never heard about him in school. I never learned about Marcus Garvey until I went to college and I was in the library just looking up, cultural books, and I ran into his book. And I'm like, wow, he had an organization that had thousands more people than the NAACP. He started a Black ship line. He wanted to create commerce between Africa, the islands, and America. Like, he created his own military outfit. Like, the things that he did, like, it wouldn't be no Nation of Islam if it wasn't for Marcus Garvey. Like, there wouldn't be this push on Black banks. There would be no Malcolm X, because his father was a Garveyite. So it's like, how did we just completely erase Marcus Garvey from history? And he inspired me. Like, the ideas that I had and I thought about, he already did it over 100 years ago, but you know nothing about him. So, for me, again, that cultural aspect, again, I'm going to get back to the bullying thing. I need to go back to that question. For me, as a therapist, I take bullying seriously, because a lot of times when the kids I see get bullied, there's a lot of suicidal ideation. There's a lot of cutting. There's a lot of issues around bullying that can really impact the child deeper than their feelings being hurt. I think the best thing to do, and some kids aren't really good at dealing with conflict, but you have to educate, empower, and teach the kid how to address it verbally. So in communication, they talk about aggressive communication, passive, aggressive, and assertive. And I think teaching your kid how to be assertive. So when you're assertive, you're not like attacking a person. You're not being aggressive, but you're also not being passive. You're being able to state how you feel, to articulate your feelings, and to set a boundary, and then if a person crosses that boundary, then you have a response to that. I think people used to laugh in school when white kids would be like, Jennifer, that really hurt my feelings. What you said, it really hurt my feelings because blah, 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 blah. And a lot of times people think that's whack and that's corny, but really it's the person being assertive. You're letting that person know, you hurt my feelings. This is what you did to hurt your feelings. This is what they did to hurt your feelings. And this is how you want to be treated. And I think with us, there's that vulnerability piece. You don't even want to tell a person they hurt your feelings, because then you feel like you're being weak, you're being vulnerable, and you feel like, oh, that person might not even respect what I say. So I would say, as far as bullying, I think that first we need to, empower our kids to stand up for themselves And, fighting is one way to stand up to yourself, but I always think about a toolbox. You got a bunch of different tools. With police, they talk about the continuum of force. First, they say their uniform is the first thing. So when you see that uniform, you should already be able to comply. Then there's that verbal command, stop what you're doing. And then it's pepper spray. Then it's a level of continuum. I think it's kids, they need to have a toolbox. There needs to be a continuum. Some things you might have to ignore. Some things you might have to address indirectly. Then you might have to address it directly. Then you might have to get an adult involved. Then you might have to get your parent involved. Then you might have to, unfortunately, sometimes have to put your hands on a person. But we want to reserve that for later. We don't want that to be the first recourse, because I always believe in teachable moments. And I always believe you teach people how to treat you. And if you are a person with strong boundaries, because everybody went to school with that person who they didn't even have to really talk. Nobody messed with them.
They set that tone.
They set that tone from the door, and they already let you know you're not going to do this to me. And that was a protective mechanism. Something could have happened to them where they know already I got to set my boundaries really strong because I don't want nobody interrupting my peace. So there's a continuum, and I think if we teach kids about this continuum and then treat the mutual respect thing, we have to. I think with kids, especially black kids and probably Hispanic, it's like a pecking order. When you go to school, you see white kids, you see everybody getting along for the most part. But with us, it's always a pecking order. Who's going to be on the top? Who's going to be on the bottom? And, and that sort of fosters that bullying attitude. I remember mentoring a kid in Portsmouth, Virginia. And, he was like, in my school, everybody a bully. And the bullies just bully other bullies. So it's just a level of everybody is defending themselves. And how can you really get anything done? And also Portsmouth historically has had one of the highest murder rates, in the state and in that region. So when you got bullies bullying bully, it's going to lead to a higher level of force and a higher level of violence because there's no communication. There's no talking. When I worked in prison, I always tell people I felt more safe being at the prison than I felt on the street. You don't see guys fighting a lot in certain prisons because you could just interrupt your good time. You can get locked down. There's so many different consequences to where you actually think about, do I really want to interrupt my peace? Do I really want to disrupt? I'm not able to be home, but do I really want to disrupt a little bit of peace and security I have in this situation? And I think when you take away the guns, you take away different things, then people learn how to be creative. The officers don't have guns in prisons either. So that officer on the street might be, rah, 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 get on the floor, do what I say. But in prison, you got 80 guys in one pod and you by yourself. You might not be able to run things, that way. So I think when you put people in situations where they have to be forced to communicate and learn how to communicate and learn how to compromise and learn how to use their resources, you can create a more wholesome person. But if a person feel like their only recourse is to fight, then you're never going to really deal with bullying because, you're going to deal with, then you got to deal with, because in Virginia, you get into a fight, that is creating a charge. You get charged now. Now you got to deal with the court system. So you got to have different levels of communication, verbal communication, and be more assertive, not aggressive, be assertive.
Why do areas predominantly populated by people of African descent still have schools where the majority of the teachers and administration are of European descent?
Honestly, I feel like we haven't done a really good job encouraging people like us to get into the teaching field. Again, I grew up in a rural area, and there's a book that she was an educator, black educator, had wrote, and I was just reading a book, and a lot of the teachers back when she taught, they went to HBCUs, and they became teachers there, and they would when the schools integrated, the HBCU sort of created these teachers, and then they were able to go out and get jobs. So most people, I say if they're in their 60s, 70s, they all they had were black teachers because there were a lot of more black teachers, getting educated and getting licensed to become teachers.
Bro, I grew up with mostly black teachers.
Right. So see that. So, but now you don't see as many black teachers going to the field, and then there's incentives for black teachers to go to schools, Title I schools, because they'll get their tuition paid back. So they may go there for a few years just for their tuition to
Go
get
there and
paid back.
suffer, bro. That's the
Go there and
hustle.
suffer, right? They go there and suffer for a few years because they know that suffering means that they might get $40,000 of debt erased. So,
You know, it's funny. I learned that when I was there because I didn't know it the first year, but I heard people talking, and they were saying this and that, and I was like, man, that's a cool hustle because they have a very hard time. They don't have a pleasant experience there.
Right.
But they just gonna stick in there to get it waived, and it's like I just think it's bad for your health, bro. I think you should just get another job and pay because they know they have a very rough time. They don't have a good experience. You know?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, but it makes even now. So now, President Biden, he created some loan forgiveness. So if you have a disability, you're able to get a loan forgiven. So people, if you out there, you have a disability documented, you can actually get your student loans forgiven if you have a documented learning disability that creates some type of workplace issue. But, you know, again, if you incentivize people to come to a certain location, that's where they're going to come. And if you don't provide opportunity, because now to be a teacher, man, the licensing process is strenuous. And it's a lot, you know, let's say like for me, when I graduated college, I was, of course, you know, I went back to school like 7 years later, but I had a daughter. I was in a relationship. You know, we had to pay rent. I had to work a second job. So it's a grind. You know, I couldn't necessarily go right into my master's program from college because I needed to provide for myself, you know, as an adult. And, you know, some people, they may have support. They may have resources to where they can go from, you know, undergrad to grad, come out, you know, and then go into that particular school and get their loans forgiven, whereas it may take us 5 to 6 additional years, you know, to get to that point. But, you know, and I'm not going to diss them because honestly, it makes sense. It's helping them out. But I think for us, we relate better to each other. Always, you know, even in school, I can remember I only had maybe 5, 6 black teachers. And I remember every one of them, each of their names, what grades they taught me. It makes an impact. Like if you can see, you said you had all black teachers. It makes a difference. Winston Sears, she's actually lieutenant governor of Virginia. She Republican, but I ain't no disrespect. But I like Winston because we had a conversation. She came to college when I was in college at ODU. This is like back almost 17 years ago. And she's from the islands. I'm not sure which island she's from, but she said that when she grew up in the island, her doctor was black. Her dentist was black. The teachers were black. Everybody around her that was successful was black. And it sort of created and instilled a sense of confidence and instilled a sense of pride,
bro.
With her.
You see yourself.
Right, you see yourself. So when she came to America, she was already there. Like she already knew who she was. She already had her identity. She seen people that look like her in successful roles. But if you go to a school and the only black people that work there is a school bus driver, the cafeteria worker, the janitor, and no disrespect to them because some of the janitors were the only people you could have that conversation with. Sometimes they were breaking up fights. Sometimes they were doing counseling. Sometimes it was the ones motivating you. And the school bus drivers, you know, were really cool too. So you see black people, but you only see them in those sort of lower roles, or they might be a teacher assistant or an administrative assistant, but you don't really see a lot of administrators. You don't really see a lot of, you know, teachers. I will also say for me, it was good too because one of our middle school sort of had a deal because the middle school used to be the all black high school. So they kind of had a deal where the principal had to be African American. So in middle school, all our principals are African American. So you sort of seeing a black male in a leadership position, and it is empowering. You know, because oftentimes you would just get sent to someone, the principal's white, you know, and you got to sit in front of this white male. You like, damn, he already know, he already thinking I'm lying, you know. So it's like a different approach. But you know, you sit in front of a black male, they can read you a little bit better. Like black teachers can read you a lot better than some of the white teachers. And maybe if they can't read you, they might not be comfortable addressing certain things. So it is much different when you can relate to people that look like you. And I really encourage people to go to school. And I think now, because there's such a lack of teachers, you can actually get credentialed a lot faster now because they want to get more teachers into the workforce. So this is actually the perfect time for anyone who's thinking about switching careers, who may have had a dream to become a teacher, to actually go and get credentialed because there's so many pathways now to do so.
I know you brought some books here you want to share with the viewers. Can you just show them the cover and tell them what the book is about?
Definitely. So the first book I wanted to recommend was Countering the Conspiracy by Jawanza Kunjufu. This book right here was really my introduction to me. When I was in college, I read this book because, again, I had ADHD, dysgraphia. I didn't really know why I was in special education. Nobody really told me. I had to really educate myself as an adult about special education. And this is one of the books that was recommended. And he talks a lot about ADHD. He talks a lot about the overrepresentation of black males in special education and the underrepresentation of black males and females in gifted education. And he just talks about a lot of those issues, and he also provides some different solutions. So this book, I really would encourage you, if you have a child with a learning disability or any type of struggles, especially black boys, I would highly encourage you to buy this book, or to even YouTube Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu and watch some of his videos, because he really hits on this point real hard. So this is a book. I did the opening for this book, and it's a book that shares success stories from 6 African American males in special education. And this is available on Amazon. It's by Dr. Rashandra King. So if you want to read some narratives and learn about what some other individuals who had disabilities did to succeed, I highly encourage you to pick this book up. This book is also in the same vein. This is a book that I was included in, Untold Narratives, African Americans Who Received Special Education Services and Succeeded Beyond Expectations. And this looks at different disabilities, not just learning disabilities, but other disabilities. I wrote a chapter in the book. Shout out to Dr. Joy Lawson Davis. She helped edit the chapter for me, but I wrote a chapter in the book, and I talk in detail about my experience. There's about 5 other individuals who talk about theirs. Dr. Sean Robinson, he's the one who sort of put the book together. He's a professor. He had a learning disability growing up, and he has a lot of literature, academic literature, which I think is really needed. We need more people to write about us on the academic level to really educate the educators, administrators, and parents about how they can effectively help us do best practices. Because I think that's something that's often missed, is that what are the best practices to help African American students achieve? Again, another shout out to Dr. Joy Lawson Davis. She wrote a chapter in this book. It's called Twice Exceptional, Supporting and Educating Bright and Creative Students with Learning Difficulties. I highly encourage your viewers to purchase this book. This book is good because a lot of times people don't think that a lot of kids with disabilities oftentimes have a lot of gifts. So if you look at someone who has autism, there's an individual, I saw a video. No, there's a picture of a kid, a guy with autism. I think he was on a helicopter. He went around the New York skyline, and he was able to draw every detail just by memory on a sheet of paper, just by seeing the skyline one time. With me, I was probably brushed off. Nobody really saw the gifts. Like for me, public speaking has always been a gift, probably because my dad is a minister. But that was always a gift. But in the classroom, there's no time for public speaking unless you're raising your hand answering the question. So it's a lot of kids who are very exceptional, but also may have a math deficit, reading deficit, maybe blind, hard of hearing, various things. But it's important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to take the child as a whole, see the gifts, and also see the areas of improvement. But this is a great book that has a lot of different contributors, different chapters looking at different issues. But I really would encourage you to get this off Amazon. Dr. Amos Wilson, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. Highly encourage you all to read this. It's not a hard read. It may look a little thick, but Dr. Amos Wilson, if you even just check out his lectures, brilliant, phenomenal black man, and probably one of the premier black psychologists who has knowledge of who he is and where he came from. And this book is really great for parents. This book was written several years ago. However, I think it's still prominent, still important, today. And I also have Push Out by Monique Morris. It's not just a war on black males. It's also black females who are also getting pushed out of schools and being criminalized. So if you're interested in reading, if you look at the data, and I always tell people, disaggregate the data. Like in Virginia, we have SOL, standard learning tests, that the kids take. And based on those tests, your school can be accredited or not accredited. If you disaggregate the data, students with disabilities, black males, black females oftentimes have the lower test scores. And a way that sometimes schools can get around that is they'll push kids out of school, because if you're not there, then your test score doesn't count. or if you have a certain disability, we can waive the test so you wouldn't have to take. So sometimes there's a push for certain kids to be pushed out of school or pushed in certain programs, so that way they can sort of eliminate some of the scores in the high stakes testing, which is crazy. Also, just resources in general. Understood.org, I talked about it earlier. If you don't really know a lot about disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, go to understood.org. They have a lot of resources, videos. You can actually message the people on the website to learn more about the different disabilities. But again, they have videos of different individuals with disabilities talking about their journeys, talking about their successes. I'm Determined. It's a Virginia-based program, but I think they're trying to nationally branch off. But if you go to I'mDetermined.org, they have a lot of resources for parents who have kids with disabilities. I will say Virginia is doing some good things when it comes to disability. So if you're watching this video from Virginia, plug in I'mDetermined.org. They have what they call a MOVE conference, which is held at Virginia State University, and it's open to everybody, but it really targets Black males with disabilities. So you have a whole group, a cohort of maybe 300 Black males with disabilities across the state, and they have different workshops for the parents, for the kids. They teach them how to tie ties, they teach them about conflict management, and it's just really a way to foster some sense of belongingness. I'm Determined. They talk about CAR. CAR stands for competence, relatedness, and the A stands for, what does the A stand for? I forgot what the A stands for. But when you talk about relatedness, like belongingness. So when you see other people that look like you, that are sort of going through the same things as you, it sort of fosters some sense of understanding and that I'm not alone. The competence piece, just I feel like fostering this idea that kids know what they're doing and that they're capable of doing that. I'm also a board member for VCU CTI, which is a Center for Transition Innovations, and it's a program that helps students with disability beyond high school, because at some point the kids will graduate from high school. Some kids with disabilities, you can keep them in the school, in their 20s, but most kids finish 18 and 19. So this provides them with job readiness opportunities. So some of them are working for corporations while they're in high school, and they may continue working for them once they graduate high school. They also have a certification at VCU where the student with disability goes to college and takes college courses and gets a certificate once they complete it. And it really just prepares them on resources, because you think about transportation. That can be difficult for someone with a disability. Accommodations at the job site can be difficult. So this program partners with local agencies and local school divisions, and then encourages them to reach out to these employers and let them know, like, hey, we have students with disabilities, we want to provide them with employment opportunities, and then those businesses make those accommodations for those students. But I tell parents, if you're a parent of a student with disabilities, don't just think about high school, you got to think about beyond that. Because if you don't prepare that student for life beyond high school, then you've done them a great injustice. Don't just think about high school, don't just think about your kid in the now, think about in the future, and make sure that you're encouraging those schools to prepare, to give your kid as many resources, education, opportunities as they can. Because once that kid graduates, the school has no obligation to educate or provide any type of resources. So make sure you think about graduation, even if that kid is in kindergarten, because that is essentially the goal. What can you do within those 12 years to prepare your child to succeed as an adult? My former special ed teacher, she told me that I teach my kids how to do life with a disability. If you have to teach your kid how to do life, because a lot of jobs, even though they say they accommodate you, they don't. If you're in a wheelchair, a lot of these businesses are supposed to be accommodating that, they're not. So you have to teach your child, even though there's a disadvantage, there's a struggle, there's a disability, how can you prepare your child to do life with that? And a lot of times kids with disabilities, they have gifts, they have skills, they have knowledge, they've already dealt with a lot of perseverance and resilience, so they have tools in their toolbox. A lot of times what they need is that direction. And as parents, our job is to direct them, our job is to be advocates, our job is also to listen and to be counselors. For me, the self-esteem piece was something nobody ever really asked about, nobody ever really dealt with, but I had to sort of deal with it internally. and it was painful. No kids want to feel like other. No kids wants to feel like they don't know anything or that they're stupid. You hear terms like idiot, retarded. These are terms, like technical terms they used to call people who had disabilities and deficits. So even the stigmatizing names of different words that we use, sometimes we have to check that. But I think, the main thing is education. If you're a parent of a kid with a disability, please educate yourself. Going to those meetings, no. Your kid may not necessarily have a disability. They may need a 504 plan versus an IEP. Understand what options you have. Understand that, with an IEP, this is federally protected. So there's federal legislation, federal, laws around what the school needs to provide for your child. You have to understand a little bit of law. You have to understand a little bit of, based on administration. So just educate yourself. And if you don't know, reach out to an advocate, reach out to a legal service to help provide you with the guidance that you need.
Please explain the difference between an IEP and a 504.
So I'm not as educated on the 504 plan versus the IEP, but just based on my understanding is that the school doesn't have to acknowledge the 504 plan. But the 504 plan can be used to help you with college accommodations. Because some kids don't meet the criteria for an IEP, but they may be eligible for the 504 plan. But if you have a school division that's good and on point, they will meet some of those accommodations on that 504 plan. But again, there's not that federal protection that the IEP plan has. So the individualized educational plan, that's a plan. So for me, I was referred by an educator to the administration. So then they do an assessment. They assess to see whether or not you meet the criteria to be in that program. So back then, they just diagnosed me as learning disabled. I read them like, damn, learning disabled. Like, it was crazy seeing that. But, so once they diagnosed me as learning disabled, then I was able to get the accommodations. So some people may need read aloud. So accommodation for read aloud means that instead of the person having to read everything, the teacher may read the test to them versus them reading it for themselves. For me, my accommodation was that the teacher had to try different spots in the classroom to find out where I was best learning at. Another one was that I could have access to a computer to do my work. So those were the accommodations. So that's written on a legal document that you sign, your parent signs, the administrator signs, the special education teacher signs. And this document is sort of what guides that individual to receive the accommodation to help them better perform in school. So this is legal. So if a teacher or school division isn't providing accommodation, you can literally take it to court and force them, to do so. Whereas with the 504 plan, there's really not a lot of protections there in place. But both are really purposeful. You can use both to succeed, but the IEP also provides manifestation meetings. So manifestation means, let's say me and you get into a fight, and in my school, fights with 10-day suspension. So any suspension over 10 days, there has to be a manifestation meeting called if the individual has an IEP, because they want to know if that fight, if their disability had anything to do with that fight. So let's say they got into a fight because the boy called the kid stupid because he couldn't read out loud. So that 10 days will get waived because that fight was related to that disability. And I think that's good because, again, I talked about pushing out. You can't push kids out with disabilities as easy as you can other students. So even if they push a kid out of school, they still have to provide a free, appropriate education for them. So they may send them to a specialized school that works with kids with IEPs, which sometimes that's good because it'll be. I did a presentation for one school. It was a school in Newport News, Virginia, and the class size was about 7 to 8 students, and they had 2 teachers in each class. So a kid that may have been in a classroom with 20 students now has a more specialized education and more resources at the school to provide support. People are educated on providing, accommodations, and oftentimes that kid will be perfect there. But then sometimes they have to go back to their filter school, and then they run back into that same issue. But so I hope that answers your question.
Why are so many American high school students graduating high school without the ability to read?
Man, yeah, a lot of American high school students are graduating high school without the ability to read. Partially, I would say part of that, when you get the IEP, there's sometimes this pressure to pass a student on, and that comes to the parent being educated, because parents have the ability to hold their kids back. You don't have to pass your kids to the next grade if you don't want to. If you don't feel like your kid has properly learned all the information you need to know to advance to the next grade, you probably need to intervene, because what I'm seeing is that interventions aren't starting until 10th, 11th, 12th grade. By then it's too late. Early intervention is best. If you can intervene with your child, kindergarten, first, second, even now in Virginia with Head Start, which is a national program, they're starting kids 2 or 3 years old, giving them those resources young, so that way they can already provide those interventions and help prepare them to succeed early on versus waiting, to your 9th or 10th grade. There's also reading programs that you can implement at a younger age to help kids with their phonics and different things. Because who wants to be 16 years old and someone is teaching me how to read? Because then you got to deal with pride. Then you have to deal with a kid who's disinterested, who doesn't really see the value of education. But when you can implement those things early, it's great. And I think sometimes with African American parents, there's sometimes this tendency to ignore early signs. Oh, the school is picking on my kid, or
I see that as definitely a denial thing,
Right. That denial thing is huge. And, even for me, my parents sort of had two different approaches. My dad was more so, I see he's having some struggles. How can the school help me meet, how can the school help my son meet his obligations academically? My mom was like, the school putting all the black kids in special education for the checks. So she was like, ain't nothing wrong with him. He doesn't need to be in special ed. They just trying to get a check. And she kind of dismissed everything. It was sort of something out there. But and I look at it, it was more protective. And it's historical. Black parents have always had to protect black kids from the system. And, for her, she was trying to be protective, but at the same time, there may have been resources available to help me do better, but to completely dismiss it might have been a detriment. So my dad sort of won the fight, so I got into special education. But I ended up blaming him for putting me in there, but not really understanding the end goal. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had, because sometimes parents get to a situation where they don't know what to do. They've ran out of answers. And then, you put a child in a situation where they have to go to special education. They may feel embarrassed and feel stigmatized, but if you never really explain to them why you're there and that, you have a learning difference versus learning disability, again, that goes back to language. Not everybody learns the same. Some people are kinesthetic, some people are hands-on. Some people can read a book and take a test and pass it after one time. Some people are verbal. Some people can hear, they can hear what's being taught and they can automatically, process that and pass tests. So first, the learning style is important, but also parents having that communication and that education and having that conversation. The adults in the room shouldn't be leading the IEP meeting. And that's what I'm Determined, that website I told you about, that organization in Virginia, they have what they call an I'm Determined night. So they have the child, they'll bring their family, their teachers, their parents in, and they'll do a presentation on their disability. So they're talking about what their disability is. They're talking about their IEP team. They might have their choir director on the IEP team, their mom, their favorite teacher. So the IEP team, you can create your own team. So everything is centered around the child versus the adults in the room making the decision for the child. And for me, that self-determination is really the motor that got me through life. And it's really pushing me to excel and do whatever I want to do. Because once you know that you're capable of accomplishing something on the most difficult level, you can accomplish anything. But when you can empower a child and educate a child on what's going on with them and let them know that you aren't learning disabled, you have a learning difference, then they can navigate life a lot better. But if you don't know what's going on with you or why you're in here or what's wrong or why teachers keep on picking on me, then you'll just go through life thinking you're the problem versus you having this learning difference that you can find strategies to resolve. But again, sometimes, our parents have that denial. And a lot of times it becomes because historically Black kids have been. I mean, Dr. Umar Johnson, you had on your show, and thank you for inviting him because his videos actually would maybe reach out to you. But he talks about how, that is the case with some families. Black kids get ushered into special education as a way to keep them out of the classroom, to keep them from disrupting the class, or just to kind of push them to the side. And now Black parents have to realize that having an IEP or being in special education comes with a lot of privileges too. And it comes with a lot of resources and a lot of support that can really excel your child to that next level. So you don't want to, again, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some teachers may be racist. Some teachers may only see the worst in your child. But if there's a situation where your child is struggling and you know they're struggling and you aren't providing them with any resource or support, then I'm sorry, you are part of the problem too.
I noticed parents seem to blame themselves when their children have a learning disability. And I feel a lot of times that's unfair to themselves. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts about that?
I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of parents do blame themselves. However, with learning disabilities, a lot of them are neurological, brain-based, which means that a parent can't necessarily give a child a learning disability. So sometimes that feeling that they've done this to their child or that they caused a problem, sometimes that creates that shame and that blame, and sometimes that fear to get help. There was one parent who was a father who was bawling in the IEP meeting because his son had dyslexia, and he had it growing up, and he felt like it was his fault that his son struggled, when it wasn't. And parents, when you internalize that shame, you don't always seek resources for support because you don't want to believe that your child has a learning difficulty. And for the parents out there, I'm gonna look at the camera, it's okay. If your child has a learning difficulty, it's okay. It's not your fault. It's not your problem. It's an opportunity to help support your child. So don't allow your trauma, your shame, your pain to prevent your child from getting the free, appropriate education that they are legally entitled to. Please, for the benefit of your child, seek those resources out. If a teacher expresses to you that your child has some challenges, don't attack the teacher. Listen, process it, and address it if it needs to be addressed. But don't allow your internal shame, your internal pain, your internal trauma to prevent you from providing that support. Because that's when we talked about earlier, that's when you see kids graduate high school without being able to read, because a parent didn't want them in a special education class, maybe because they were in a special education class and they know what it's like. However, in 2023, special education is much different than 1983 special education, even 2003 special education services. I think kids now are a lot more tolerant of differences.
They seem much more chill, bro.
They're much more chill.
They don't like pay them any mind.
Right. They don't. And those inclusion, they don't pay the kids any mind, because I think kids are a lot more understanding and empathetic than adults are. But I think kids too, when kids were ignorant and didn't know, when you used to send the kids to that special education room, and I know because they put me in that room, you didn't really know. What you don't know and you don't understand, you fill in the blanks with your own mind. My book, Nelson Beats the Odds, I had a kid, he wasn't even in special education, but he, at the end of my presentation, he thanked me. He was like, every single school needs to have your book. He was like, I'm not in special education, but I appreciated learning about what those kids go through. And I think every kid in special education, should have your book. And Kwame Alexander, who's a children's book author, who's very successful, and me and him are friends now, but when I first started writing, I saw him at a conference, and I asked him, I said, what advice do you have for a young author writing a book? And he said, he had mentioned that, he said, books are windows and mirrors. He said, books are windows because when you read a book, you see into the life of someone else, whether it's a fictional character or a real character. But as mirrors, you can read a book and see your exact experience in that book, and it's educational and fulfilling. but providing kids with a book where they can see their reflection, but also a book that can educate kids who don't have disabilities, it sort of, accomplishes two goals. And I think having kids understand and know about disabilities, now you have TikTok and people with disabilities on TikTok doing different things. There's a lot more education now than it was back then. So parents really don't have that excuse of I don't know, because there's a ton of resources. There's a ton of different things out there for you to look up and figure things out. And even if you don't want to put your kid in special education, there's Sylvan Learning Center. There's a lot of other resources outside of the school, because I think a lot of times too, we rely too much on the school to solve all of our children's problems. Now with all the resources, I've seen someone build a house off of YouTube. So if somebody can build a house on YouTube, you can educate your child based on the resources that are available for you. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be challenging. And some parents have kids who have different levels of disabilities, and some disabilities are much more intense than others. But there are resources available. There's parents like you all over the world. Finding a support group is good. But, again, education is important. And parents, please, 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 if you don't listen to anything I say today, do not blame yourself. It's not your fault. However, you do have access to resources, and it is your responsibility to provide your child with the resources they need to succeed.